My name is Megan Corcoran and I co-chair the Gaining Provider-led Business Steering Group. We were set up to design, implement and embed the processes industry requires for business switching. For the purpose of this presentation, mobile is out of scope, but geographic and non-geographic numbers are in scope. Under regulation, Ofcom defines switching as where the end customer wishes to move their voice and broadband services from one communications provider to another at the same location. Ofcom has introduced changes to the general condition, which means that residential and business customers of all sizes must be able to switch voice and broadband services to a new provider, using the process led by their new gaining provider, regardless of network or the technology their existing provider uses. Switching for residential customers goes live later this year on the 12th of September, and business will then follow. We don't have a date right now. The business switching process, together with all the associated documentation, can be found on the FCS website on the link on the slides. There's a plethora of documentation there, so I would urge all CPs to familiarise themselves with it. This is the first business switching webinar, and it's a high-level overview, and it's the first of a series of webinars that will cover business switching in the detail required. I now hand over to Laura Meakin and Dave Stubbs, who will take you through the high-level regulation and process design.
So welcome to the first Gaining Provider-led Business Switching Steering Group Industry Engagement session. Thanks for watching our first recording on the Gaining Provider-led Business Switching process. The Gaining Provider-led Business Switching Steering Group is made up of a range of communication providers serving business end users, including wholesalers, aggregators, network resellers, trade associations, and different CPs who've spent thousands of hours working on a switching process to work for the whole business market. The group is set up to design, implement, and embed industry processes to support complex and simple business switching of fixed voice and broadband services. Throughout this process, we have and continue to engage Ofcom on process principles and our approach. The aim of the session today is to provide you with an overview of that process, and it's aimed at CPs providing business of voice services, excluding mobile, and CPs providing internet access services to end users, irrespective of their network provider. Through this session, industry leads from the Gaining Provider-led Business Process Steering Group will give you an introduction to the new Ofcom switching regulations, share some of the industry process principles, and update you on the proposed process at a high level, which will support retail providers to meet their switching obligations, whether that's as the gaining retail CP or whether you're the losing CP. We'll also explain how you can get feedback or get involved with the new process going forward. From April 3rd, 2023, Ofcom introduced changes to the general conditions of entitlement. These changes meant that consumer and business customers of all sizes are able to switch certain services to a new provider, using a process led by their new gaining provider, regardless of the network or the technology that their existing provider uses. The switching rules apply where there's a service that is an internet access service or where it's a voice number-based interpersonal communication service, or NBICs. And those voice services are, of course, excluding mobile. The regulation introduced a single industry switch process for consumers or residential customers, and you'll hear that referred to as one-touch switch. For business switching, Ofcom required industry to create and operate a switching process, and that's the Gaining Provider-led process. The Gaining Provider process leads the switching process, but will need to work with the losing retail provider to coordinate and complete the switch. This includes where a customer wishes to switch retail providers and/or the network. I'm going to give you now a summary of some of those key changes that will happen as a result. One of the first areas that's changing is the switching dates. Going forward, these should be as soon as possible or at a date driven by the customer. Need to note that some network operators are moving from fixed lead times to minimum lead times within their order journeys to support faster switching. Another area of change has been around compensation. New rules were introduced relating to business switching within the Ofcom general conditions, linked to delays or failure to comply with General Conditions C7. Under new rules, express consent has also been introduced. The gaming provider must ensure that the customer has expressly agreed to the switching of their business voice and/or broadband services and should retain evidence of this. There are also changes to communication as well. Both the gaining and the losing provider will need to keep the customer informed throughout the business switching process. The losing provider must not attempt to frustrate the switching process. And in the new journeys, the concept of cancel other, where the losing provider may reject a switch for legitimate reasons, will be removed as part of the new Ofcom general conditions. And this too is going to be reflected in some of the network operator business switching journeys. Cancel alone will stay as it is today. Key principles. So in order to provide a business switching process that meets the Ofcom regulatory requirements, we needed to define a process to enable communication between both the gaining and the losing providers to support both simple and complex business switches. As I mentioned on the previous slide, one-touch switching supports the residential process. Our industry gaining provider-led business steering group came together to define a workable process to support pan-industry business switching requirements. Before we walk you through the high-level end-to-end business switching process, we thought it'd be helpful to share with you some key principles and concepts which will underpin the new business switching journey. The new regulations and associated accountabilities are focused on the retail CPs. In other words, the providers who have the contractual relationship with the end user. The concept of a retail communications provider and a retail CPID are introduced for business switching. This will mean that each retail provider will need to register each of its main retail brands, that is, the name that you'd normally see on the bill, for the new business process. This will allow a gaining provider to readily identify the losing provider when they're talking to their customer. Retail CPs must also be able to support a losing journey, even if they decide that they no longer want to switch any new customers to them. The process focuses on both the losing and gaining retail CPs' responsibilities, and that's irrespective of the supporting supply chain. So whatever happens today, as part of your supply chain activities, they'll still need to be completed and are not incorporated into the switching process. Retail CPs must also keep their customers informed through the process. In order to support this, we also recommend that the impacts of switching are also clearly communicated to the customer so they understand what will happen as a result of the switch. We're also, through this journey, introducing the concept of an asset list. We recognise that in some instances, customers may not have all of the asset information that they need for all of their services, especially for internet access services. The new process will introduce the opportunity for a customer to request that information. The request is sent to the losing retail CP in order for them to gather the information and send it directly to their customer contact. This process provides a mechanism to enable retail CPs to be compliant. However, it's worth remembering that each provider will still need to make sure that they complete activities that exist both inside and outside of this process to make sure that they remain compliant. So this process provides a mechanism to enable retail CPs to be compliant. However, each provider will still need to complete their activities that exist both within and outside of the process to be fully compliant. The new process accommodates the full range and complexity of switching scenarios that exist within the business market. And we've considered a number of the different switching scenarios to make sure that we can accommodate all of them within this process. As a final note, and I'm sure as you appreciate, we're not a regulator, nor are we an enforcement body. This process was developed after many hours of industry expert input. To date, this is the only pan-industry process for voice and broadband business switching that we are aware of. Many business CPs, some larger and most smaller CPs, may not wish to develop their own interface and will choose to access the switching hub using a managed access provider. A full list of the recognised managed access providers is available for you to consider on the Topsco website. So we've taken you through some of the process principles. Now Dave is going to take you through the high-level process and a walkthrough of the journey.
Hi, this is a walkthrough of the GPLB business switching process. The basic premise for business switching is to try and keep it as close in implementation to the one-touch switch process as possible, to make it easier for those that have already implemented one-touch switch to enhance their existing solutions to support business switching. And also because a lot of information already exists in supporting the one-touch switch process. That will bring benefits to the business community in implementing their own solutions. What this means in practice is the messaging protocols are still the same, and the messaging formats are based on those used by one-touch switch as well, with a few enhancements. Here you can see in black the same messages are used for business switching as used for residential. The red are the new message formats implemented for GPL switching for business, and those we'll cover in a bit more detail as we go through this demonstration. Business messages are different to the residential messages. There are more parameters and they have a different name, but ultimately they are built on the same principles with the same core content. Business switching differs from residential in that instead of having to get a match of all services and the customer in the first matching step, the important piece is to actually identify the customer successfully. Services can still be supplied on a match request, but if they are rejected, that doesn't stop a switch order being issued as long as the customer has been successfully identified. How much information needs to be supplied to get to match will very much depend on the size of the customer, the nature of the sites that they're switching, and whether all the services can be clearly identified by identifiers, or if they are not identified, then the sites to which they relate to. The matching journey can be as simple for a Soho-style business as it is for a residential customer, following a match, order, and switch simple message flow. But in more complex business scenarios, multiple sites, multiple services, switched over time, parallel running, the message protocols will support those. Let's look at a real customer example. Here we have a customer who's got several sites, only one account, and only one service provider. Business switching will support much more complex scenarios, but let's keep it simple for now. Our customer decides they want to contact Orange Telecom because they're switching from Purple Telecom. They initiate the conversation in the sales channel and they take the order in the normal way. The gaining provider is going to ask the customer if they'd like to manage the switch on their behalf from their current provider, and our customer accepts. Now the gaining provider needs some details. They ask the customer for the company that they're switching from, Purple Telecom in this instance, a service address that will be identifiable against that account. Anyone that they're providing new service to will do. an identifier that's going to clearly identify that customer to that existing provider, like an account number, a private service identifier, not a public one. Anything like that will do. If the customer doesn't know everything, that's okay at this point. We're just trying to get a match and identify the customer. Let's assume they know it all for a moment. Our new provider takes the order from the customer and in the background sends off a match request to Purple Telecoms. Now this process can take a little time. Unlike one-touch switch for residential, businesses aren't always automated and fully online, but there is an expectation of being able to get a response from your current provider within 24 hours for relatively simple requests, and it may take a little longer if you've got more complicated matching to do. For example, hundreds of services and lots of sites. There may well be providers that can turn a response around in minutes if they're fully automated, but the process has to allow for those that aren't. So your mileage may vary depending on who your customer is switching from. Our losing provider receives that request to do the switch, checks their records, identifies the customer, and having confirmed their identity through account numbers or from a private identifier held against their records, is happy to respond and provides a switch order reference, or SOR as we know them, that allows the gaming provider to proceed with switching activities. If services were also supplied on the match request, they're checked by the provider as well, and if they match, a successful response will be returned, but any that don't match can be indicated it's still a successful match request because we still identified the customer. Only those services that didn't match will be flagged for the customer to do some other checking with. At this point, I'd like to talk about asset lists. Customers don't always know the services that they have, or at least they can't provide identifiers for the losing provider to match them. More often than not, this would be broadband service related, but could also be for telephone numbers where they don't know the full extent of the ranges they own. In this situation, the match request provides the facility for the gaining provider to request an asset list to be provided by the losing provider to the customer. The losing provider has an obligation, given the information supplied in the match request, to supply that customer with a list of all of the services they provide within the scope of the request, and for each one, clearly provide an identifier that they would be able to match and respond against on a subsequent match request. These asset lists are sent directly to the customer and not to the gaining provider, as exposure of a customer's assets would be a breach of privacy. Let's see what that looks like. Here, the losing provider has created a list of all of their assets and sent them to the customer via email or via post to a contact identified on a match request. With the asset list in hand, the customer can now contact their gaining provider again to raise an appropriate match to add the extra services to their request. Because the losing provider had already issued a switch order reference, the gaining provider can just simply raise a service request for the additional services that the customer wishes. This keeps the process simple by not having to go through elongated switch matching again, and just focuses on what's necessary at each step. So let's recap for a moment. Our customer, through their new provider, has been identified by their losing provider on a match request. They've identified all of their services and have been issued a switch order reference for all the remaining transactions to be processed. No orders have yet been placed, so there's no obligation for the customer to switch and no direct action for the losing provider to take at this stage. They've clearly been identified by the losing provider. The gaining provider knows that they can deliver service and switch for them. Let's see what happens next when the customer is ready to proceed. When the gaining provider is ready to proceed with their order, they will send an order request to the losing provider to indicate which services are going to be switched and when. The losing provider acknowledges that request, validates the services from the switch, making sure that those being requested to switch have actually been matched previously No new services can be added at this stage without first going through an additional match step. The losing provider may use the information in this match order to start processes in terms of understanding what to do with the losing service for that customer, generating communications to keep them informed of any processes or costs involved, and also they may begin to start the process with their wholesale supply chain if that's necessary. It's important for the gaining provider, if dates changed, to keep the losing provider informed of that so that they can change those customer services and make sure that they don't get disconnected unexpectedly. The same is true if the customer cancels their order and wishes to retain service with the existing provider. When the gaining provider has finished supplying services and the customer is satisfied and ready to have their services switched off, they will instruct the gaining provider to inform the losing provider. Depending on the type of order and how many services there are, this may be automatic at the point of provisioning your new services. In other situations where the customers prefer dual running to test their services before switching off their existing lines, the customer would give that instruction to their new provider. At point of disconnection, the new provider will contact the losing provider with a trigger request, a switch. This clearly indicates which services to switch at this time. Not all services have to be switched if the customer isn't ready to, and they can leave some services for later if they're still testing. The losing provider acknowledges the switch request and is required to cease billing where appropriate immediately at that point. The gaining provider may specify a date by which their services were provided and the switch was requested if making that request was slightly delayed, in which case the losing provider should backdate their billing to that date. The losing provider does not necessarily have to disconnect all the services at that point in time. They just have to ensure they are no longer billing the customer for them. In the event of a switch of voice services, number porting would have followed the number porting processes to remove the telephone numbers and switch them to the new provider, alongside the switching process. It may be that there are other services still being supplied by the losing supplier to the customer, and the customer would have to contact them directly, in which case to cancel those. Once all services are switched for a customer, the remaining services, if any, that no longer wish to be switched, would be cancelled by the gaining provider, and the transaction would be concluded. So in summary, we match and identify our customers first. We identify their services, and where necessary obtain an asset list if we need to do so to get accurate information. Once a customer is ready to proceed with their switch, the gaining provider would initiate that, and they keep the losing provider informed of any changes of dates or cancellations if the customer is no longer wishing to switch. And finally, when their new provider has delivered their services, they inform the losing provider to cease their services and to stop billing. Now let's talk about some more complicated switches and what that means. Customers may well be switching services from multiple vendors, in which case the processes in this presentation would be followed for each losing provider, and the gaining provider would have a switch order reference related to each of those provider journeys. More complex switches are accommodated by allowing multiple sites to be provided on different match requests, or by specifying different account numbers. Multiple match requests could be sent referencing an existing switch order reference, so you build up a complex profile of a customer and their services without having to have hundreds of different switch order references. And each service or site or account could be progressed at whatever pace the customer wishes to proceed. Not all services have to be requested on an order at the same time, or switched at the same time, or updated at the same time. The messages facilitate both scenarios. Now, a word on customer protection. It's recognised that in a more complex environment of business switching, that the chances things go wrong exists. In those situations, we've provided a notification message within the framework. Its intent is for the losing provider to be able to inform the gaining provider when a situation arises that they should be aware of. For example, unintentional or malicious switching. It's expected that the gaining provider should communicate with the losing provider with the information supplied in the notification to resolve the issue before proceeding with the switch, if at all.
You've heard from Dave and Laura, but as well as the process that they have described, we are also working on other activities. We are engaging with the number porting fora to discuss improvements that could be made to number porting to complement the gaining provider-led business switching process. We're also engaged with TOTSCO and the managed access providers to deliver a technical solution and also to understand pricing, as there is no current pricing available. We have also been looking at having a dispute process as part of the gaining provider-led business process and are discussing feasibility. We think this will be very important in scenarios like erroneous transfers or the end customer hasn't agreed to a transfer. We're also looking at emergency restoration and understanding how this could be achieved. There's also a plethora of exceptions that we're working through or unhappy path scenarios. And the last one is something that we're looking at, which is customers switching from residential to business or business to residential at the same time as switching providers. So what are the next steps and how can you engage? Business switching technical delivery is under assessment with TOTSCO and the managed access providers. We have got a detailed process document which is available for review. There's also a lot of other documentation also available for review on the website on the slide. If after reviewing the documentation you have any questions or feedback, please drop an email to the email address on the slide. If you're a potential user of the business switching process, please think about which managed access provider you wish to sign up with, or if you're going to build your own API using the TOTSCO Hub. Thank you very much for listening.